Hey everyone, what up? Mad Kaiser here. Now, if you watched my review of Chrono Trigger, which by the way you should if you haven't already, you'll notice that I said some key things. Live Alive Remake, as well as I have been alongside director of Live Alive, Takashi Torita. I hope I'm not butchering that. Yep, that's right. Because while Chrono Trigger is a masterpiece and had some impressive things like, say, handling time travel throughout multiple eras, as well as uniting characters from all to face against a massive threat that would doom all of existence, there was, of course, another game that actually came before it, and in a sense, on paper, came up with those exact same ideas, just wasn't fully realized, of course, until, well, Chrono Trigger. And that game was Live Alive, being led and directed by Takashi Torita, who you may know as the co-director of Chrono Trigger, and was released originally in 1994 for Super Famicom, where its main selling point was instead of having one full story, there's multiple stories, a lot of which being different time periods inspired by lots of movies and game genres. Though it didn't do great financially, selling just around, say, 250,000 units alone, as well as the fact that it never came to the West. Though it did receive a following over there, thanks to a fan translation. However, in 2022, the game itself got Resurgence back at a Nintendo Direct, where it was announced that it would get a full-on HD-2D remake by none other than the GOAT developer themselves, Team Asano. With this game releasing on Nintendo Switch at July 22nd, 2022, and sold around 500,000 copies, which was a massive leap over its predecessor, though probably would have sold a little bit more if it wasn't against both Digimon Survive and Xenoblade Chronicles 3. How unfortunate.
Disappointed!
But it did come to both the PlayStation 4 and 5, as well as PC via Steam around April 27, 2023. And such, I'll be reviewing the remake on the Switch. And just like say with the Telemarie remake, this is my first full-on exposure with Live Alive. But before we begin, if you like what you're seeing here, then by all means, like the video, click the subscribe button if you're new, and hit that bell notification icon if you want more JRPG content from yours truly. Not only that, but I'm currently going to work on my Persona 5 750 subscriber special, where I'll be able to play and review on what might consider to be one of the best JRPGs in the modern era, which is Persona 5 Royal. And hopefully before this year ends, I'll have that out, so please do look forward to that. And with that said, back to the video. With that said, grab your stick, set your traps, punch a rock, get in the robot, play some Captain Square, and go Street Fighter as we blend in, as we dive straight into Live Alive. Now, since this game actually has multiple stories that are both standalone and culminate into a final one, I'll be doing things a little bit different here and summarize every chapter in order that I played it in. So first off, we have its prehistory, where we're at the Stone Age and we meet Pogo, a cave boy who actually later discovers a beautiful girl that is actually the target of another caveman tribe who plan to sacrifice her for their god. Then we have Imperial China, who revolves around the Earthen Master Roshi, aka Shifu, who's living his last days in life and decides to spread his legacy by finding 3 disciples and to train them, though will have to face a threat that will bring them dishonor.
Finally, a worthy opponent. Our battle will be legendary.
Then we have the near future, which revolves around a teen named Akira, who's actually a psychic, being able to read minds after being traumatized by his father's death, and lives as an orphan, picking fights against biker gangs, till he finds an evil organization capturing humans to use to revive their god. Also, Giant Robot.
Shinji, just get in the spot.
The present day then focuses on Masaru, who is trained to be the very best, like no one ever was, by challenging on the strongest fighters around the world. The distant future, which you can guess is set at the far future, is where you get to play as a robot named Cube.
But I remind you, I'm an expert on humans, not robots.
I'm not Bender, I'm Fry.
Really? I thought you were the robot.
Who's actually part of a space crew in a ship coming back to Earth after acquiring a very dangerous specimen, though things start to go wrong there. Then we have the Wild West, which follows an outlaw named the Sundown Kid, who teams up with a nearby townsfolk and a bounty hunter to set up an ambush and fight against the Crazy Gang. Then we have the Twilight of Edo Japan, where Shinobi Obumaru must infiltrate an evil temple to rescue a very influential figure that will help free Japan from its locked status. And then we have the Middle Ages, which centers around a warrior named Orsted, who bands together a group of heroes to help rescue the princess from the Lord of Darkness. And lastly, we have the final chapter, which basically unites all the heroes from every chapter era to have a final showdown with the overarching evil. So these are the stories, and I have to say, a lot of them are pretty enjoyable, mostly being short and standalone experiences, which makes the game itself unique, a trait that both the Saga series and Octopath would take to extent, though that aspect really fleshes out in Octopath Traveler 2. Now, some are very simple and basic, like say Prehistory and Present Day and the Wild West, while some are more emotional, complex and interesting, like the Middle Ages, Imperial China and the Distant Future. And even the characters within each era are solid to likable, though there are just some I didn't really care about, like Pogo and especially Akira, who really just got on my nerves and is kind of really. Now, some characters do even have some character moments within said stories. Ones that really resonated with me would have to be Roshi and his disciple, who I picked was Lei Kugo. Then we also have his Cube and Obumaru. Helped by the fact that this remake offers full-on voice acting, and each character is performed very well, with standouts being none other than Suzy Yang, who you may know as Yuffie from Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, being Lei Kugo for example. And we have the final chapter, which itself was pretty awesome, and basically the Avengers endgame of Live Alive.
Avengers!
No wait, I already made that joke already. Now, the quality of the chapters in terms of writing do vary, and not all are home runs. So I thought why not quickly list every chapter written from worst to best. From the very bottom we have his Prehistory, cause while I do like that this is the only chapter that uses body language and grunts, it's really basic, forgettable, and the potty humor got old very quick.
Monkey!
Next we have his Near Future, which is basically a mecha anime, and while it tries to go complex and serious with its twists and revelations, as well as Akira as a whole, the tone with the professor really shatters, and the turtle really just does, break the immersion, and you have things like waiting for a kid to give you an item for 4 times on the bog, and having to chase a kid repeatedly was annoying. And Akira is just But the whole final moments and the theme song do slap, so I'll give it a pass. The Present Day is probably the simplest story out there, as it's mainly just more focused on the combat, but I did like Masaru. The Wild West is also very simple, which pays homage to classic western films, and Sundown was pretty cool. I especially even loved the ending. The Imperial China one really got me emotional, especially when you see how much time Roshi has lived, and not gonna lie, it really got to me when you see the fate of the disciples. But when you get to things like say Twilight of Edo Japan, Distant Future and Middle Ages, they all hit so well story-wise. And yeah, the final chapter is very peak, and I'm gonna say that without spoiling it, because honestly, holy crap. So when it comes to the visuals, man does this game look absolutely beautiful, using Unreal Engine 4 but in the HD-2D style that Team Asano is well known for. obviously in games such as the Octopath series, as well as Triangle Strategy and Dragon Quest III HD-2D Remake. Whenever that game releases, now remaking the Super Famicom's visuals from the ground up, with just having very nice detailed environments and up-to-date character designs, as well as some beautiful lighting, and all of it staying true to what the original game looked like. Some of these eras just look absolutely beautiful, especially Edo, Japan, with having just such a stunning backdrop, as well as some combat and spell animations looking absolutely dope. Performance-wise, it does run mostly well on the Switch at 30 frames per second, though it does start to drop a little bit when you use some heavy particle effects, especially fire-related attacks from Obumaru that just blast the screen. Outside of just that, everything else looks absolutely beautiful. And we're finally here, onto the huge haunt meat of the game. Now Live Alive is a turn-based JRPG, but unlike a lot of them, it has more of a grid-based style, something you see in more tactical RPGs as well as even the Trail series, giving your characters more freedom to move around and having an emphasis on positioning. Now both your characters are given a charge meter, which is sort of close to an ATB gauge, though not really, as you don't see it rapidly grow in real time. And when that bar is full, that is when your turn begins. And unlike a lot of turn-based JRPGs, you don't have a normal attack, as your main method of combat is mainly around your abilities, all of them having both passive and defensive moves, as well as having the option to use items, as well as both passing and waiting for your next turns. And the more you level up, the more you get new abilities. Key focus mainly for the game is to find which ability is effective enough on taking down enemies and bosses, and finding what are vulnerable or resistant to. Though, don't take that immediately to account. And each move has their own positions that you have to make sure it's very aligned to the enemy. Some of them can be instant, though more powerful ones from both you and your enemies can take long enough to charge, leaving yourself vulnerable until next turn. As well as some of them can also be interrupted with certain attributes, giving you more of a risk and reward approach. Some abilities even throw elemental status effects, some of which even affect the tiles, and those who interact it get affected by it, whether they're either weak to it or immune to it. And other abilities can also inflict status elements, though they're not always effective. And there's also counter moves, which depending on attacks, either you or enemies can automatically perform counter attacks to retaliate. Another thing is that if you lose your HP, you are in a down status, and you need either a party member to use a healing item or ability that can heal multiple party members to revive. But if an enemy attacks a member who is downed, they are completely dead and removed entirely from battle, so be wary of that. There's even a gimmick where you face against an enemy who has a yellow flag, and if you defeat that enemy, every other enemies around it will be automatically insta-killed. Generally speaking, I overall found the combat in general to be pretty solid and enjoyable for the most part, with its emphasis on positioning and figuring out which ability is effective. It overall made battles enjoyable, and was a really fun system all around. But there is some instances where the gameplay itself really felt odd. One instance is of course the difficulty, where in my opinion it fluctuates all over the place within each chapter, with the first one basically just kicking my ass, mainly due to having just high encounter rates, which both this and the Middle Ages obviously be the only ones to have random encounters, as well as just not having too many items and just being low leveled, I guess. Though in other chapters like say Imperial China and the Wild West, it was a little easy. I don't know if it was intentional to make the parts of these chapters stand out, but just felt kinda weird. Even if the bosses themselves, while cool for the most part, most of them are just way too easy, even when you figure out their pattern, with maybe bosses like Obi-Wan Lee or Oda providing a decent challenge, and obviously the final chapter's final boss obviously. though what attributed to that fact is that basically you are able to spam the same abilities that can deal a good amount of damage, some of which don't even cost too much or charge either, and this basically breaks the bosses and encounters with whatever move just does the most damage, and that really takes the strategy kinda out. And another thing that's kinda odd is the whole resistance and vulnerable readings. As read clear, it shows you what abilities enemies and bosses are weak and resistant to. And the thing is that resistant attacks mainly involve around having reduced damage, and being vulnerable would normally be increased damage. Though there are just instances where certain abilities where enemies and bosses are resistant to can still take a good chunk of damage, and even then some vulnerable attacks only just do a meager amount. Which honestly, that does seem counterintuitive for a system like this, based on at least on the design standpoint. Though the other thing about the gameplay that stands out with Live Alive is that each chapter has actually its own gimmick and gameplay styles to make them stand out, like say prehistory and Middle Ages, leading more to the classic RPG formula with having random encounters, though the former has a sniff mechanic for Pogo I guess. As for Akira, he's been able to read minds, and Shifu's one is where you're able to train your students and they are able to learn his skills. And with Masaru, it's about him facing against bosses and learning their skills when he's attacked. And basically just doing one full-on 1v1 against bosses, Street Fighter style.
This is Ryu, from Streets.
Cube's chapter has literally next to no combat at all even, which mainly focuses on the dialogue and puzzles and invading the alien. Sundown's one involves you around setting traps, and Obumaru. Oh boy, Twilight of Edo Japan. A stealth-based infiltration giving you an option to go pacifist or genocidal lives while roaming around such a maze of a castle. And not gonna lie, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, as honestly, this chapter just sucks. It's repetitive, annoyingly tedious, going through the whole castle back to back and forth, especially when you get bamboozled by one boss, and my god, is it such a drag. And that to the point that when you have a new foe that stands in your way, I just want to be done with this chapter. And while I do like the narrative it's going for, gameplay wise, both this and the prehistory one are my least favorite chapters, and even the near future doesn't fare better. While there are some gimmicks that work fine, others like the stealth mechanics and the whole idea of trying to go pacifist or genocidal just doesn't work with the maze-like design. And honestly, I just really don't like this chapter at all. Then we move on to, of course, the music. And what can I say that hasn't been said? The music here bangs. It bangs so good. Composed by none other than the legendary goddess herself, Yoko Shimomura, who actually even did the original soundtrack, as well as also having among just amazing composers, and she brought her masterful skills to make the songs in each chapter stand out, with having lots of amazing piano, violin, and other instrumental works. Many of having just amazing character themes, battle themes, and especially the boss themes. So, time to do the thingy and transition to a select few of them. Lastly, we have is the content. So with the remake of Live Alive, there are some things they have, including some chapters that have alternate dialogue paths and choices, among some mini-games in, say, the prehistory and distant future, as well as even the final chapter having some optional dungeons, each containing at least a secret box, and you also have things like a jukebox listening to the game's very stellar soundtrack. My overall playthrough of this game took me just over 20 hours to beat, and for a game like this, that is perfectly well fine. And finally, we have reached the end. So with that said, what do I think about Live Alive now having played it? Well, simply put, I enjoyed it. It was definitely worthwhile and a crazy experience, going through multiple characters that had their own scenarios and characters that pretty much made me fell in love with, while also having a pretty solid battle system that kept me mostly engaged, and just looking very pretty and just having a banger soundtrack. It's far from perfect, mind you, as some of the chapters do vary in terms of quality, whether it's due to the padded length, odd story writing, and downright annoying gameplay choices. And while I would say the combat is good, things like the inconsistent difficulty, as well as just having some odd design choices, do sort of hurt in the long run. But overall, it was an experience I can't forget, and still, in many ways, it did feel like a blueprint of Chrono Trigger, everything from the different eras, as well as having a recurring main villain. It's all there, and more that really inspired Chrono Trigger. And there's also been recent talks that Tokita would love to make a sequel. Wouldn't that be nice? Imagine a Live Alive 2 with having new types of film and game genres to pay homage, whether it be like say a kaiju inspired brawler, or maybe even a stealth based spy thriller, or even a downright superhero one. Maybe even expand some of the old game's chapters that leave themselves open to a follow up, and even improve upon the battle system. All that said though, Live Alive is definitely a good game, and I highly recommend any JRPG fans to give it a try. So with that, I'll give it a solid 3.5 cubes out of 5. And like again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys enjoyed this review, and let me know down in the comments if you played this game yourself and what you think about it. So until then, Mad Kaiser out.